In this video, we'll be talking about death tolls for various causes. People tend to debate about what group has done more harm, and a lot of times these attitudes on a societal level are the precursors to genocide. The thought being, if you get rid of the bad group, bad things won't happen. These arguments are petty and they attempt to justify large-scale discrimination. Also, these arguments have led to many myths about various groups. So let's go ahead and get started by tackling religious wars. It's a favorite citation by atheists as to why religion is bad. You may have heard about the Crusades and the massive death tolls. You may have heard it was the worst religious war ever, and that it was against Muslims. Well, let's get down into the details. The Crusades are estimated to have killed between 1 and 3 million people, about the same number as was killed in the Vietnam War. To look at it another way, the Crusades took hundreds of years, and on the low end, the estimate is 1 million people. In 1994, in 100 days, 1 million people were killed in Rwanda. Another point is that all the Crusades were not against Muslims. In fact, one of the deadliest wars was actually in France against a rogue Christian sect called the Cathars. This leads us to our next interesting fact. The worst religious wars perpetrated by Christians were against Christians. The worst Christian war was not the Crusades, but the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire between the Catholics and the Protestants. Around 8 million people were killed. Of course, like most wars, it started as a religious war and turned much more politically fueled after that. The next deadliest was another Catholic-Protestant war in France. It actually happened before the 30 Years' War and resulted in around 3 million deaths. Now, those numbers are very high, but let's put all this into perspective. World War II was around 75 million deaths. China has had 6 wars where the death toll was over 20 million people. Of course, to put wars in perspective, we can look at Black Death, which killed up to 200 million people. Now, let's look at the citations people use against atheists for their evil. You may not know that communism, as defined by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, requires state atheism. This state atheism requires laws against religious activities. In the USSR, they introduced a belief system called scientific atheism and started a culture war. The USSR ultimately killed between 12 and 20 million Christians. Now remember, that is just Christians. Include other dissenters and religions, and you're around 70 million people. In Cambodia, from 1975 to 1979, Pol Pot, who instituted state atheism and executed Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists, had around 2 million people killed. Now, often China is cited slightly incorrectly for their atheist killing. While they were and still are state atheists, the mass killing was not really directed at religion. What China is correctly cited as is the counterpoint to the idea that religion is what causes wars or has done the most damage. In the mid-1900s, under Mao Zedong, somewhere between 40 and 70 million people were killed through starvation, prison labor, and executions. That is almost as many people as World War II. On a side note, depending on how you view forced abortion, China has either killed 336 million people or just forced 336 million people to abort having children. So what is interesting is that under Marx-Lenin communism, there have been 3 major mass killings that on the high end could total over 140 million people. So in the 20th century, potentially over 200 million people were killed, making it the bloodiest century in history. If you did it as a percentage of the population from 1980, you were at around 5% of the population was killed. Now, if you do a lot of very fuzzy math, you can get this huge generalization of what the last few centuries look like when it comes to the percentages killed in wars. In the 1200s, around 3% are killed thanks to the Mongol conquest. In the 1300s, it's less than 1%. However, Black Death kills around 30% of the population. In the 1400s, around 5% thanks to the conquest of Timur and the 100 Years' War. In the 1500s, it's less than 1%. However, resources are being devoted to colonialism, and the death tolls in the Americas are wildly speculative. So it could be around 5%. In the 1600s, it's at around 6%, with the Qing dynasty and the 30 Years' War adding significant numbers. In the 1700s, it's less than 1%. Perhaps it was just peaceful. In the 1800s, it is back around 5% with multiple major wars in China, and then we already talked about the 1900s with 5%. So what is in store for us in the 21st century? If we hit 10 billion people in global population, then 5% is 500 million people. So people seem to want to associate these wars with being caused by one group or another, but the truth is, almost all these wars and mass killings happen because of fear that another group was going to destroy everything. The clear enemy here is fear. The Catholics feared the Protestants. Atheists feared religion. Nazis feared losing their people's identity and position. All of these groups, in an effort to stop what they believed was bad, committed the worst atrocities known to man. To quote Franklin D. Roosevelt, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. If you like our videos, go ahead and subscribe to our channel, and we'd love to hear back from you guys, so feel free to leave your thoughts down below in the comments section.